Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Tara Puckey. I'm the Executive Director of the Radio Television Digital News Association. Thank you so much for being here today. One of the organizations that RTDNA works regularly with is the National Press Foundation. And one of the core principles at both of our organizations is mental health and wellness. We know that the work journalists do is so critical and so important, but we also know that it's not an easy job. And specifically, when we started talking over the last couple of weeks, we recognized that not only were journalists telling the story, specifically in California, they were living it. And it really made us want to address some of the challenges that we know happen when you are experiencing crisis as part of covering crisis. And we recognize that we are not the experts in that field, but thankfully we do know a wonderful expert in that field. So we were really blessed to be joined by Gretchen Schmelzer, who's here with us today. She has worked with both of our organizations in the past to really hone in on how journalists are responding to this difficult work and the things we need to pay attention to and what we need to be doing to address some of those challenges. So I won't take up any more of the time because she's really the one that you all should be hearing from. So again, thank you so much on behalf of our TDNA and the National Press Foundation. And Gretchen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tara. I'm really glad to be with all of you today. I have been sort of on the other side of the fires, working with Division 5 of the California Forest Service, who've been in the Angeles forests and doing a lot of work around that. And so I've been really aware of the impact of the fires on various groups and really was motivated to be a support to you guys. I'm a psychologist by training. I spent the first 15 years of my career working with kids and families outside of Boston, and then moved into leadership development through a project with the UN, helping countries strengthen their response to HIV and AIDS. And more recently, my colleague Carolyn Murphy and I have started the Center for Trauma and Leadership, and focusing really at the intersection of organizations and trauma, especially in fields where trauma is a routine part of the job, like journalism. I believe that there's a chat function that you can throw questions into. And I will pause occasionally and see if the questions are arising. I have a good solid 45 minutes of information. A lot of this, or much of this, may be a reminder to you, but I think when we are going through trauma or crisis, we need the reminder. So just take what's useful, leave what's not useful. Take good care of yourself. If you need to step away, you can do that too. Let's see. There's also a mental health reporting fellowship, so you can QR code that. So one of the first things to pay attention to is that when you think about mental health, is that the very definition of mental health is oriented around the ordinary demands and stresses of life. And there's absolutely nothing ordinary about the demands and stresses of your job quite often. Most people don't see or hear or read or listen to the amount of trauma that you do on a daily basis, let alone when you're doing it in the context of that context being where you live as well. So when we think about mental health in fields where trauma is routine, we have to think about kind of bolstering resources in a much bigger way. You can't have kind of average preparation for a very difficult job. It would be like saying, I only have to walk 30 minutes a day to climb Everest, right? You have to take care of yourself. The other thing is that mental health is really impacted by our field. So, journalists have reported 4 times the rate of anxiety and depression than of other fields. 60% of journalists have reported symptoms of anxiety, depression, or PTSD. And 80 to 100% of journalists have reported exposure to trauma. It's a real thing. And I guess, it's important to acknowledge that those of you who've been reporting, I mean, there, those of you who've been reporting in California with the fires, you've been reporting, watching footage of Gaza, you did the reporting for Asheville. You have witnessed and experienced a lot of loss. And so just let yourself feel that and acknowledge it. The thing about trauma fields is that you often notice the after effects later because you all have really good coping skills that got you to where you are. And so often what happens is your worldview shifts more than your behavior. So you start, I work with emergency room physicians and emergency room pediatricians who started looking at their own children differently after a long time in their jobs. They worry more. They say no to a lot more to their kids. So it's important, and only you will notice this shift in you. Other people may not. So, as not to bury the lead, let's look right away at how newsrooms can support mental health in journalists. First, people need to be trained and educated. You need language for this. Partly so we can normalize the impact of trauma rather than pathologize it. You work in a field that's got trauma, so let's find language and normalize it. Secondly, the newsrooms and organizations that are around trauma can offer support, whether it's peer support, professional support, time off. I mean, one of the problems around trauma just in general is that we often shoot to the individual and we don't think of a collective. And you can look at supporting things at the individual level and should, but that's not the only place to solve some of these problems. And the other is that managers and leaders, for those of you who are on the call and for those of you who will become managers and leaders in the future, you should learn how to have these conversations. Partly because trauma is a workplace issue. You spend most of your time at work. Adults spend most of their time at work. And if we don't make workplaces places where people can have conversations about trauma, where you can heal and grow, then we're losing out on adults' capacity to do both of those things. And workplace and home life have become inextricably linked. Your laptop, your phone, those things, there's no separation between those. You're looking at them at work, you're looking at them at home, you're checking up on stories. Your job is like in social media, in the news, on TV. You almost never get a break from it. And so we have to make it so that you can carry these conversations in all the places in your life. So not all trauma is the same. And there's different kinds of trauma. It impacts you differently. And so I'm going to take you through the different aspects so you can sort for yourself where you're being most affected. The first form of trauma is acute trauma. It's what we mostly think of as trauma: a single incident, a car accident, gunshot. The definition is that it's an experience or event that overwhelms your capacity to defend or protect yourself. The hallmarks of trauma are helplessness and fear. So we lose the capacity to think we can protect ourselves. It's also why trauma is different for everybody and why there isn't, well, one thing for somebody's trauma, it's not for somebody else, because we all have different capacities for protection. Think of it as we all have different height levees and we get flooded differently based on the height of our own internal levee. Acute stress or trauma is a physiological event for any mammal. It's the same for your dog as it is for you. When we are under extreme stress or trauma, our bodies gear up to either fight or flee. So our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, our respiration goes up, all our blood goes to our major muscle groups, our focus narrows. And for our brains, I'm going to do a example of what happens to our brain under extreme stress is that, and you could play along if you wanted to pick a hand, our arm is our spinal column. The palm of our hand is our brain stem. Our thumb is our limbic system, and our thumbnail is our amygdala, the part of your brain that's actually scanning for danger at all times. And our forefingers are our neocortex, our thinking brain. Our middle finger and ring fingernails are our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that connects all the parts of the brain together and is our executive function system. And when we have an experience of acute stress or trauma, what happens is we flip our lid. And all we have left to think with is our brainstem and our limbic system, our emotional and survival systems. And our thinking brain is essentially offline. So there are two ways that we slow down and bring our brains back online. One is diaphragmatic deep breathing. That's because if we were going to fight a tiger or run away from a tiger, either way, we'd be breathing pretty hard. And that deep diaphragmatic breathing is the only automatic relaxation response our body has. It triggers our brain to release chemicals to slow us down. The other way that our brains come back online is to find a calmer brain. And this is a really crucial point. If you take nothing else from this conversation, having a calmer brain around you brings your brain back online. This could be your pets, this could be a person, and you can be this for each other. So when you know you have colleagues in a place where there's a lot going on, call a friend, call the person you went to journalism school with. Be the calmer brain. Or if you weren't out reporting and you are back in the office, when they come back in, be the calmer brain. Because that will actually do something. We often worry about whether we have the right thing to say. Don't worry about the right thing to say at the beginning. Just be a calmer presence. And I want to go back. The freeze response is when our body perceives that neither fight or flight will work. And so we freeze. The next form of trauma is repeated trauma. So, the fires went on and on. It wasn't one day of fires, it was weeks of fires. And when trauma gets repeated, our body doesn't gear up, our system doesn't gear up because we are too smart. Our bodies and brains are too smart to waste that kind of energy. So what happens is that we begin to create protections and defenses. We go numb, we begin to shut down, and we conserve our energy. It's so that we can use all our brain attention to getting through our days. We move into survival mode. And repeated trauma is really three forms of trauma. What happened? So the trauma you experienced. Then a second form of trauma happens because you now have these survival mechanisms that that become a habit, right? You shut down, you may pull away from people, or you might get really people pleasing, or you might get really perfectionistic. All things to make you feel less anxious. And then the third form of repeated trauma is what didn't happen. It's the growth and development that can't happen while trauma's occurring. And on a very basic level, you can start to ponder, like, what didn't I do to take care of myself, or what kind of maintenance didn't get done in my life while that trauma was occurring? And that's just a very small form of what didn't happen. But if we look at COVID, which was a repeated trauma that went on for a long time, what didn't happen were a lot of social skills. Right? So kids in high school and college didn't learn to work in groups in the same way that they had pre-COVID. And now colleges and even graduate schools and medical schools are having to kind of rethink their curriculums to put that in place. In order to heal from repeated trauma, you need to attend to all three. Our culture loves the trauma story, right? I mean, you guys know it, you report on it. But all over our culture, we believe that if somebody just tells the story, they're going to heal. And that's not true. You need to attend to what happened, to whether the protections you used to survive it are still serving you, and to start building what didn't happen. The other thing that's really important for journalists is that trauma impacts the way our brain orient. So our attention shifts, adrenaline narrows our focus, which means our peripheral vision, both in vision and orientation, goes away. So we may not be paying attention to um, important information or important groups. Trauma impacts our memory. So at the moment of trauma, blood is routed away from the hippocampus where and the language center of the brain, so that trauma often isn't even encoded in language. It can, and it also gets fragmented. So it gets fragmented into images, into feelings, into sounds, but not a coherent narrative. So trauma impacts the way you take in information, the way you store it, and the way you retrieve it, which is why when you're trying to interview traumatized people, you don't always get a clear, linear story. The last thing is that trauma impacts time orientation. Because of the feelings of helplessness that go with trauma, as I mentioned earlier, we don't like that feeling of helplessness. So we'll reorder the time sequence so that we feel like we had more control. So we'll imagine that we thought that something happened before it happened, or we'll foreshorten time. People who experience trauma will sometimes feel like they're going to die younger than they did before, that their life shrinks. And so it's important to reorient to time after a traumatic experience. You can do this in very basic ways by, checking your calendar every day, watching days go by. You can grow a plant. I mean, all this sounds simple or silly, but actually just reordering back to a time orientation helps expand your view. The third form of trauma I'm covering is vicarious trauma. So the first two, acute and repeated, I was talking about as if it happened directly to you. And many of you experience that, especially covering the California wildfires, and partly because you live there and it's your world. But sometimes in your work, the trauma isn't yours directly. It's what you're witnessing in other people. When you hear about it, when you read about it, when you witness it, when you take photos of them, when you edit the photos. And it's a change of the inner experience of you as a result of witnessing somebody else's trauma. I was a professor at Northeastern University when the Virginia Tech shootings happened. And just watching the footage of that whole event changed the way I saw my job when I went into school that night. I walked into my classroom. I paid attention to where all the exits were. I paid attention to what I could put in front of the door to protect my students. My experience had changed. My view had changed as a result of witnessing an event on television. The interesting thing about vicarious trauma, if you look at these signs and symptoms, is that they are the same exact signs and symptoms that you get if you experience trauma directly to yourself. The reason for that is that our brain really doesn't make a distinction between what I'm experiencing and what I'm watching you experience. And the reason for that is that we have these things called mirror neurons in our brain. And the mirror neurons in our motor cortex are watching other people at all times. So if I throw a football on screen or pretend to throw a football, if you're watching my arm, your mirror neurons in your motor cortex are lighting up as if your arm was throwing the football. And it's why babies can watch you and like stand up and try to do what you're doing. We are wired to watch and learn. But these mirror neurons means that when I'm watching somebody suffer, there's a part of my brain experiencing that suffering. And it's the basis of empathy, so it's not a bad thing. But we have to pay attention to it when we're in jobs where we're experiencing or witnessing trauma a lot. Some of the warning signs, like how do you know when it's gone too far or when you might need help? If you look at the list on the left, hypervigilance, poor boundaries, avoidant behavior, numbing, addiction, chronic exhaustion, all of those behaviors are, first of all, you probably can see yourselves or bosses you might have had somewhere in there. But they're all protections. They're the second form of repeated trauma, the what I did to survive, right? How I protected myself. And they become kind of hardened, and you're only using those to an extreme. And it's when you don't have enough of a balance of other ways to cope or manage that these become a problem. The fourth form of trauma I'm going to speak to is I'm actually going to call grief, partly because in situations like you've been in California, there's a lot of grief that's out there. First of all, grief is, so the definition's acute sorrow, deep sadness at loss, right? It's very personal. It's asymmetrical because you don't come to grief as a blank slate. It links to other, grief tends to link to other losses that you've experienced. So when we get hit with grief again, the old ones come back out. Um, and it's intermittent, which means that you can feel it, and then there'll be a period of time where you like resurrect or come back, and then you can get hit again, and you won't sort of don't know when. It's like having your back to an ocean set of ocean waves where you don't know when you're going to get hit and knocked down. The other thing is that you can have grief. We often think of grief at the loss of a person, but you can have very deep grief at the loss of a landscape, at the loss of a place you lived, at the loss of a community. So the grief that is happening right now in California is bigger than just the people, or even bigger than just homes. It's a loss of what once was that isn't going to be the same and may not be the same for a long time. And the last form of trauma I'm going to talk about is moral injury. Moral injury isn't a psychological state, it is a hit or a wound to your identity, to your sense of self. Um, it's when you don't get to act in a way that is congruent with who you feel like you are. If you are interviewing somebody who's now homeless and can't, and you're getting the story, but you can't help them in a way that you wish you could help them, that can be a hit. I worked with anesthesiologists who worked through the pandemic. And in the beginning of the pandemic, they didn't know how to save people's lives from this disease. And toward the end of the pandemic, they knew a lot more, but they were still sitting with the people who died at the beginning of the pandemic before they really understood what they were dealing with. The thing about moral injury is that it's an individual holding a collective problem. So when soldiers come back from war and they have moral injury about having to behave in a way that is incongruent. They had to shoot dogs or grandmothers, or they had to behave in a way that goes against who they really are. They didn't individually wake up one morning, decide to go to Afghanistan and shoot a dog. They were part of a collective that was ordered to do those things. So the antidote to moral injury is community. It's it's that we have to create spaces for a larger group to hold the pain that an individual's holding. And your field of journalism needs to create spaces amongst you where you can share these with each other. And if you can, share them in community spaces. I understand there's a lot of difficulty with the press and communities right now, but that would be the like aspirational goal, is to start creating places. When what we do we have a culture that likes to call people heroes. The doctors and nurses during COVID, or the first responders during 9/11, or our soldiers when they finish something very difficult, and we call them heroes, and then they don't ever get to share their story. They are stuck with their own moral injury because now they have to hold the story, because the narrative that gets created is so different than the one they're experiencing inside, right? And I don't know what your version of that is, but it might be really important to pay attention to. So, as I said, no one comes to trauma a blank slate. It's been my experience that in fields where trauma is routine, often people come to these fields with histories of trauma, childhood trauma, or previous trauma from other work. So in the Forest Service, we have a lot of ex-military. In first responder, police, a lot of histories of childhood trauma. And so first of all, that's something to pay attention to. It's both, it's a both and. There's a lot of good that comes from a history of trauma in the sense of compassion and understanding and awareness and the ability to pay attention and sit with people through that. And the protections that come with surviving trauma can sometimes get in the way of seeking help and being able to work with others or trust others, right? So then if you take these last few weeks, you add traumatic events to that. So it's a bigger well on the side of trauma. The thing about it is that if you pay attention to that green circle in the center, if you create a buffer between your childhood trauma and where you are now, you actually have lower levels of vicarious trauma than other people because you have lived experience, you've taken care of it, and you know what you're looking at. So you need to pay attention to your wellness. You need to be able to pay attention to just the repair, kind of the maintenance and repair that it takes to do these kinds of jobs. The way I think about it sometimes is like if I've worked in Cambodia and other countries where people use Land Rovers because there aren't paved roads in a lot of places. And those Land Rovers were beat up. Like they needed a lot of help to stay functional. I've also lived in Wellesley, Massachusetts, where like the Land Rover next to me at Whole Foods did not have a rough ride there, right? So you have to think about the maintenance and repair of yourself, given the work that you do. Um, the supervision or support inside the organization needs to be solid and any outside support. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the other two things that can really affect vicarious trauma or trauma in the workplace is the organizational culture or the workload. An example of organizational culture, I worked in a hospital where the social workers would often have to stay late to manage cases and make sure people were taken care of. Well, the organizational culture was such that even if the social workers stayed, till 2 a.m, if they didn't clock in at 8, they were considered late and went against them. Right. So the organizational culture didn't at all take in the impact of the job on those people in real time. And if your workload's such that you cannot really attend to that green circle, you're going to experience more vicarious trauma. So it's one of those things to pay attention to, that you're balancing a lot of things. The system that I've been working with and we've tried to create is something we're calling ARTS, the Adaptive Repeated Trauma System. It's a way of thinking about trauma where you say it's going to happen. Because partly what has been happening up until now is that people act like it's an aberration, or they do trauma informed, which is really about the other people. Like if I'm a physician and I'm doing trauma informed work, it's about my patients, not me. And I want the systems and the people inside these systems who are experiencing trauma on a routine basis to really pay attention to what's happening for them. So it's really 3 parts. If in a crisis, you need to stabilize. Once things are stable, you need to attend to day-to-day maintenance and repair. And if day-to-day maintenance and repair isn't enough, then you should look at what it takes to heal and engage the healing cycle. We're going to talk less about the healing cycle today because you've been going through mostly acute trauma. And I can direct you to my book if the long-term trauma is something you want to heal from. So the first thing around crisis stabilization is almost like a flow chart, right? Are you physically safe? If you're not, that's the first thing. If you are physically safe, then I like to ask people if you've experienced this crisis before. Have you lived through the forest fires already? Is there previous wisdom you can lean on? Are there previous inner resources you're leaning on? I want people to be able to go inside themselves and gather any resources they have, whether knowledge or like emotional experience, so that they have that really at the forefront of their minds. Have your routines been disrupted? Are you able to like get your morning coffee? Are you able to have the meetings that you're supposed to have? Are you able to uh, pick up your kids when you thought you were? Like the getting some of your routines back in a crisis can help you feel more stable. Have your support systems been disrupted, or can you contact them? Right? I mean, if you go back to COVID, people were had a hard time staying connected with the people who were their support systems, and that destabilized them. And then the last is, has your ability to work been disrupted? And if it has, then the goal is prioritization. How do we think about what is the most important thing to pay attention and do? When we think about maintenance and repair, I like to bring in the roller coaster of extreme stress. This is a model created by Gil Martin, who works with law enforcement. And the idea is that in jobs where trauma is routine, whether it's law enforcement, journalism, emergency room doctors, the thing about your jobs is it comes with adrenaline and hypervigilance. It has to, right? So you go to work, you shoot above the line. And actually, above the line, often you feel pretty good. You can feel like yourself. You're on it. You're doing your thing. And then you go home from work and you plummet below the line. And you're in your comfy chair, drinking your adult beverage of choice, scrolling on your phone, and kind of numb. And then you go to sleep and you go back above the line, and you just keep following this weird roller coaster, never stopping in the middle inside your window of tolerance. The one thing to pay attention to is that once you plummet below the line, it would take your body 18 hours to reset on its own. And you don't even get that time because you go to sleep and you shoot back above the line. So the key to this is that you have to own this roller coaster in order to get to center, which is where your body repairs. It's where you have the biggest brain for complex situations and problem solving. And it's a place where physiologically your body gets to rest. In order to come to center, you have to own the roller coaster. So if you're above the line and headed home, you need to do something that's soothing for you. And that's really different for everybody on this call. That might be listening to music. It might be talking to a friend. It might be watering your plants when you get home. It might be talking to your kids. It might be baking. I mean, everybody mowing your lawn, whatever. If you've already plummeted below the line, you need to energize because you're now numb and out of your body. So you need to do something that dance it out in the kitchen, go for a walk, move boxes, do your dishes, but coming back into your body. And, just one thing, this is another pause moment, like if you take nothing else moments. If you can own this roller coaster, if you can write down 3 things that you know will help you come to center if you're above the line, and 3 things that will help you come to center if you're below the line, and post it somewhere or put it in the notes section of your phone, it's very helpful and it works well. Which brings us to the whole topic of resilience. And just before you tune out and say, like, I don't want to be more resilient, I will say that my soapbox about resilience is that resilience isn't about, just getting endlessly strong and being able to take anything. Resilience is an emergency response system. I liken it to a spare tire. If you are driving, you should have a spare tire, because if you get a flat, then you can get to help and put it on, right? It's a safety mechanism. But you shouldn't, if you have a donut and you put it on, you shouldn't be driving on your donut all the time. You should get to help and get the tire fixed or get a new tire and put it on. So resilience is about the ability to bounce back, but it's really about the ability to bounce back because you have this emergency response system you can use for a short period of time. And I think we've gotten kind of away from that somehow in the larger culture of thinking about resilience as just getting stronger and stronger and stronger so that no matter what hits you, you can take it. There are three forms of resilience to start when I'll expand it out. But the first is the resilience that you have within you. It might be your values, your purpose, your experience, your skills, your talents, your strengths. All of those things help you be resilient. Resilience might be your relationships, right? The people in your life, who you can call for help. Um, and and it might even be people who are no longer here and who you're leaning on in your own mind. And then the last form of resilience here is something bigger than yourself. Those are your beliefs, your faith, um, your noble purpose. And those three sit inside a much larger circle, right? So we're resilient also because of the teams that we're on. I mean, all of you have probably worked on teams that were super resilient, and you may have worked on teams that felt really brittle, right? And you've worked in organizations that felt more or less resilient. And community, I mean, think about the forest fires, that you will feel less resilient because your community isn't as resilient. We are in a systems point of view means that everything happens bidirectionally. You aren't alone by yourself. You are interacting always with these systems and you feel the effect of them. And when they're stronger, you feel stronger. And when they're less strong, you feel less strong. And that's just real. And then, so we've talked about crisis, we've talked about maintenance and repair, that section. And this is healing from repeated trauma. And in order to heal from repeated trauma, you need to start at preparation. So that yellow band is really the biggest chunk of work that most people ignore. I liken healing from a trauma as a high altitude climb, partly because healing from trauma, a lot of the actions are fairly simple. They're conversations, they're taking care of yourself, they're journaling, they're nothing that you don't know how to do. But the impact of what you're about to say, the truths you come in contact with are bigger. And the same is true if you're going to walk the last 300 yards on Everest. You've been walking since you were 18 months old. You know how to walk, but without oxygen at that altitude, after hiking for 12 hours to get there, those 300 yards are much harder. So you need to prepare, and you need to know what your resources are. You need to understand what trauma is. You need to build good relationships in your life. And then as you feel prepared and safe, you'll begin to let the trauma story out, and be able to it'll come up and out, and then you'll start naming what's happening. And as you do, the whole story comes together in integration. And then you'll be able to look at those three forms of trauma, the what did happen, your protections, and what didn't happen. And in consolidation, you get to really focus on the what didn't happen and build some new skills. And you cycle around this until you don't need to anymore. It's not a linear thing, and it's entirely up to the person going through it. So let's just think quickly about the grief that you guys are holding, and allow for the fact that you know something about your experience that other people don't. You know something about the experience of the people that you're interviewing or covering that maybe other people can't because you're living it with them. But you only get to use it if you can sit down with it and be with it. So I'm going to give you some ideas of how to hold all of this. One is just acceptance. And you're going to accept what you're feeling. You're going to recognize that there are no wrong feelings. And also sometimes feeling for some people, it's easier to pay attention to feelings that are physiological. Like you might feel a lump in your throat, or you might feel that your stomach is tight, or you're nauseous, or you're antsy. So you can start looking at how your body feels if you don't know what the words for it are, or it doesn't strike you as an emotion yet. You're going to identify your feelings and put a name to it, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then you get to do something with them. You can cry, you can write, you can take pictures, you can create, express, but take that feeling and make it an action that's safe and expressive, really. It's about expression. The research really shows when we express an emotion, especially if somebody can witness it, our anxiety, depression, trauma all goes down. So this is the feelings wheel. It's at thefeelingswheel.com. You can print it out. And you will, this webinar is being recorded, and you can print pages out. If you can actually find the name, if you can get specific about emotion, it also lowers distress. And to support your conversations amongst yourselves and amongst you and your families or communities, name what you experience as the grief or loss or hurt, whether that's the loss of a person, a place, an experience. Risk the conversation and risk feeling awkward. Like none of this it's like we all want to have the right conversation, and we're sort of all afraid of saying the wrong thing, but we work our way towards the right thing. And in relationships, getting it right isn't the predictor of a good outcome. The predictor of a good outcome in relationships is repair. So you try to say something and you're like, oh, let me try that again. And you can even like come back an hour later or a week later. So risk saying it and saying it awkwardly. And understand that there's no linear process through this, and that everybody's got their own trajectory. The other thing that I think is important, and I think this works really well in these fields where trauma is routine, is to understand that you're not trying to get rid of trauma or grief. You can't. Like, it's part of your job, honestly. You're going to experience vicarious trauma in your job. You're going to experience, some of you are going to experience out and out trauma in your job. So at any given time, your trauma is on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is the least and 10 is the most. What you're trying to do is actually look at the second scale, which is increasing your ability to cope with it, right? And that's the scale that you're going to build muscles at. And it really is about building emotional muscles, coping muscles, having more tools in your toolkit, knowing when you have to shift or change. So one of the things that I found very helpful in organizations is this idea of base camp. So you're going to create a space that will give you a place to both start from and return to. That's what base camp does in a high altitude climbing. It allows a place where people can get acclimatized, to check their equipment, to learn skills, to build their teams. And you are going to create that for yourselves by having all of this in one place for yourself. So what are some of the strengths that you rely on? Knowing what your strengths are and being able to lean on them when you're in crisis or trauma or grief is hugely important. Recognizing what are some of the routines that support you. Like, being able to go for your morning walk, or walking your dog, or coming home for dinner and talking to your kids, or playing Tetris at night, whatever your routines are, know what they are. Who is on our team and can offer support? That team is not your work team per se, although those are people are important, but actually it's about I think of the Tour de France guys who have an entourage of people who support them in their efforts, right? Tour de France guys have like a nutritionist and a mechanic and a massage therapist and a trainer and a coach they have all these people. And we can have people who support us in our work, even though it will look really different. So, who's the person you call who will listen no matter what? Who's the person you call who will tell you like it is? Who's the person you call who's really good at grief? Or who's the person you call who's really good at conflict? Like, who are your board of directors around the work that you do and you know you can lean on them. And often what I found with adults, especially people who are more senior, is that some of those people have fallen by the wayside. They've retired, they've moved, and you didn't really realize that you were losing some of your support team. So it's a good thing to scan and see, who do I have to support me? What are some practices or activities that help me? These may be less frequent. These might be trips to see family or vacations or weekend hikes or things that you don't get to do as regularly. And then this last question is really important. How do I know it's time to slow down and return to base camp? What are my signs of stress that say, you know what? I'm losing my keys this week. I need to really pay attention and slow down a little bit. And all of these questions can be done on the individual level, like me, what do I need to do? And if you're part of work teams, you can have this as a team discussion. How do we know we need to slow down and return to our base camps? So you could do this conversation at both levels.